After the bizarre and wonderful stint in The Tingler, Price's career in science fiction and horror would continue to gain momentum, with several appearances in various horror and sci-fi projects, including The Bat and the sequel to The Fly. But at the turn of the decade, it would be an encounter with legendary film director Roger Corman that would see a working partnership form that would spin into a multi-picture deal. In 1960, Roger Corman was beginning to get quite fed up with an arrangement he'd had with the film studio American International for a number of years. The agreement basically gave Corman the budget to produce 2 low-ish budget black and white pictures, and if they did well, which they often did, the agreement would roll on to another 2-picture deal. But Corman was beginning to get frustrated with the limited scope that this kind of arrangement offered, and wanted to really break out and do something special. So, he went to American International and proposed a make-or-break deal where he would produce 1 higher-budgeted full-colour picture, and if it became a success, he'd be allowed to continue doing that. Corman had, for a time, wanted to adapt some of the works of Edgar Allan Poe, and in particular he wanted to do The Masque of the Red Death. However, when he pitched this to American International, they weren't entirely on board with the idea, as only a few years previously, Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal had been released to tremendous success, and both The Seventh Seal and Masque cover very similar ground. Basically, they were worried that it might be interpreted as being a retread rather than something new. So, instead, Corman chose to adapt another Poe classic, The Fall of the House of Usher, with Price in a leading role, and it was a huge success. So, naturally, AI wanted more of the same. And so, with a modest budget and an entire back catalogue of work, Corman chose the next film, The Pit and the Pendulum. And because his working relationship with Price went so well with Usher, he was pulled right back in to play one of possibly his most twisted roles. And that's saying something. The plot of The Pit and the Pendulum is only loosely based on the original Poe short story. It's only really loosely covered in the 3rd act of the film. What this film does that's interesting is that it builds a completely original 1st and 2nd act that it then bolts onto that short story to create a more complete narrative. So basically this is 33% Poe to 66% Richard Matheson. The film opens and we're introduced to Francis, who's travelled from England to, well, the accent says America, but the scenario says Spain? So we'll go ahead and say Spain. After receiving news that his sister has died unexpectedly, with no explanation as to exactly what has happened, he hops a ship and then a horse and buggy to a cliffside castle owned by the family Medina. And upon arriving, he's greeted by Catherine, the sister of Francis's sister's husband. And almost immediately we're dropped into a stodge of multi-threaded plots, as we're quickly introduced to Nicholas, the current heir of the Medina family home and all its possessions, who was also the husband to Elizabeth, Francis's sister. When Francis tries to get an answer out of Nicholas about his sister's untimely demise, he simply tells him that a doctor checked her after she came down with a mystery illness, and that unfortunately she died fairly quickly from this mystery illness. When Francis inquires about where her resting place is, Nicholas informs Francis that a Medina tradition is for all the family members to be bricked into their own small tomb within the castle's cellar. Feeling way in over his head, Nicholas and Catherine offer to let Francis stay for the night, and he somewhat reluctantly agrees. Later that night, Nicholas drops in on Francis and begs him not to pry into what happened with Elizabeth and to just accept that she died of a short illness. Francis politely tells him he'll do what he needs to do, so Nicholas takes Francis to Elizabeth's old room, which has been perfectly preserved down to the smallest details from the day she died. From here, however, the plot only thickens further, as over lunch we're introduced to Charles, a longtime family friend and the family's doctor. Francis finds out that Charles was the doctor who confirmed Elizabeth's death, and, with little time to waste, he asks Charles independently what Elizabeth died of. And without time for Nicholas to corroborate a story, Charles tells the truth, that Elizabeth didn't die of a short-term illness. Rather, she died of fright. This revelation shocks Francis, but the only reason Nicholas told Francis that she died of an illness was to hide a deeply guarded family secret. That secret is that Nicholas's father, Sebastian, was one of the most ruthless members of the Spanish Inquisition, and that in the basement of the castle, his father conducted some of the most brutal and ruthless torture that the Inquisition ever saw. Sebastian loved his torture chamber and crafted it by hand, especially for the purpose of inflicting as much malicious pain as possible. His father was quite mad, you see, but Nicholas can't quite bring himself to get rid of the chamber for reasons I won't spoil here. It's at this point that Nicholas explains that because of this background, the castle has an ominous presence. At first, Elizabeth was happy and full of life, but the oppressive nature of the castle slowly took away her lust for life, making her weaker and weaker. One day, she found Nicholas's father's torture chamber and became fascinated by it. Concerned by this growing intrigue, Nicholas planned to flee the castle with Elizabeth. However, on the night of their escape, Nicholas overheard a terrified scream, and after pounding a path down to the torture chamber, he finds Elizabeth trapped inside an Iron Maiden, her dying last words being, "Sebastian." Francis is obviously deeply hurt and frustrated by these revelations, but Catherine tries to rationalise with him, explaining a dark family secret that Nicholas would rather not revisit. That during his childhood, Nicholas witnessed his father torture his uncle and mother to death after his father discovered that his wife and brother had been having an affair. And further still, after some somewhat paranormal goings-on, Charles reveals that unbeknownst to Catherine, Sebastian actually entombed his wife alive within the basement, with Nicholas watching on in horror. It's at this point that Nicholas reveals he has a deep traumatic fear of both being buried alive and that Elizabeth has been buried alive. And the spooky goings-on in the castle make him believe that either Elizabeth isn't dead or that she's haunting Nicholas for prematurely burying her. This all leads to even more paranormal happenings within the castle that seemingly could only be Elizabeth's doing. That is until Francis discovers a series of secret passageways within the castle walls and accuses Nicholas of being behind all the maddening happenings and destruction. Nicholas vehemently denies this, but slowly begins to consider that he may be acting outside of his own mind, basically losing his senses and causing havoc and then returning to normality as a means of psychological torment over his loss. To settle things once and for all, they decide to excavate Elizabeth's tomb, both to put Nicholas's mind at ease that Elizabeth is genuinely dead and hadn't been buried alive, and also to 100% confirm that she's definitely still in there if she is dead. But, as is the case with these kinds of movies, things don't exactly go to plan. And I really can't say any more about the rest of this film from here as it gets into major spoiler territory. And I don't want to spoil this movie for you lot, as I'd consider it a must-see film. Now, I don't want to sound like a broken record here, but there is a lot to love about this movie, and chief amongst them is the script. Considering that they only used the original Poe story as a springboard, what they've built from that by working backwards is seriously impressive. This is a real horror thriller in almost every sense, and honestly, there were some twists in this that left me firmly stunned. This is one of those films where the first time you watch it, you'll be astounded, and every watch after that only enhances the experience as you see all the little subtle nods and references here and there that point to the big reveals, and ultimately it creates a very satisfying viewing experience. The pacing is absolutely spot on. Not overtly gear-changing, but allowing for a smooth flow between the typical 3-act structure that never really overstays its welcome. I mean, this is an early 60s movie, so there is a little bit of over-explanation in places, but it's not really bad enough to be a point of contention. And given the twists and turns of this movie, you're always left with a feeling of, are they over-explaining this because it's going to be super important later, or is it a red herring? In fact, the only critique I have on the script front really lies with the dialogue, which, while there are some classic lines in this movie, it's all a bit strained at times because this is supposed to be an 18th or 19th century period film, which means, at times, it can suffer a bit from overwordiness. Sometimes even simple conversations like, let's go to bed and forget about the ghosts in the castle, get stretched out to 3 to 5 minute long conversations. I mean, I know that language has shortened somewhat over the last 3 centuries, but I just can't escape that somewhat nagging feeling that the writers used ye olde worldy writing to help pad out the runtime a little bit in places. The script was written by Richard Matheson, a veteran scriptwriter with a ton of experience. Most notably, he collaborated with Corman and Price on a number of the Poe film adaptations, but he also wrote scripts for movies like The Devil Rides Out, The Amiga Man, and to prove that at the end of the day he is just a mere man and not a god, he did write Jaws 3D. Here though, he's in his prime, and I say that his work here is easily amongst some of his finest. And, as if I even need to go into the history of the great Roger Corman. At the time of writing, he has 419 credits as a producer and 56 directing credits. It's a testimony to his resilience as an artist that at the age of 95 and in the midst of a global pandemic, he only has 3 films currently in production. The man's totally famous for never stopping, never resting, and pretty much never giving up. Or rather, if Corman gives up on your movie, it was doomed from the start. And here, his work as a director is simply exemplary. It's a visual delight, a grand, sweeping movie that at times has more in line with a painting than traditional filmmaking of that time. There's a grand and clear vision captured here, from sweeping, moody shots of the castle through to almost gothically carved minimalist designs of the Pendulum room itself. Equally, there are tons of matte paintings used in this, and all of them are absolutely superb. Do they look believable? Not particularly, but they give a stylization to this film. The vague and almost Monet-esque style used, combined with the dark and moody scenes, really helps give this movie a grandness that most modestly budgeted films of the time could barely hope to achieve. But that's Corman all over, always able to squeeze every last drop of functionality out of a film's budget. I would call it working thriftily, because it is, but that implies it looks cheap, which it doesn't. I don't know how the hell he's actually managed to make this film look as good as he does on the budget that he had. I'd also like to take a moment right here to say that the set design is just absolutely incredible. Everything has this rich and lush gothic vibe, with royal blues, rich reds and emerald greens to melt your heart. The important thing to bear in mind with this film is that it was on a bigger budget than normal, but it wasn't that bigger of a budget. And it's astounding what's been achieved given the cash that they had. The castle feels sprawling and impossible to really keep track of. The location sequences seem grand and sweeping, with the coastal stuff in particular being nothing short of breathtaking. And I really have to compliment the crypt and torture chamber work that feel decrepit and damp and in disrepair. This film really is a visual delight. The cine too is really pretty sublime, with a good set of solid sequences built from a more than decent range of shot types. A good chunk of this film is shot wide and mid-wide, which really does emphasise the coldness of the castle. The cine really goes the extra mile to create a feeling of foreboding horror. Close-ups are used somewhat sparingly here and are only usually used in more tense moments to help create a feeling of terror closing in. Using this technique sparingly significantly amplifies its effectiveness. Furthermore, this film does go the extra mile by implementing several seriously out there experimental sequences. From super small things like tinting the film to block colours for flashback sequences, which was highly reminiscent of the 1920s and 30s technique of block colour film stock usage, through to full-blown psychedelic freakouts during the third act and a gorgeous oil sequence that opens the film. The experimentation is highly welcome and really gives the film a decent kick up the backside at times to help pull it back on track. A small gripe I do have is that the more experimental scenes don't quite transition in or out of the period-based, rigid cine sequences that well. It would have maybe been nicer to have the cine direction begin to loosen up a bit just before the more experimental stuff to make the transition a bit smoother. But then, the argument could also be made that hard-cutting to the more abstract directional and cine choices from the previous rigidity creates a harsher contrast that increases the power of those more out-there moments. Both are valid points, but it would be interesting to see what a smoother transition would do to the structural integrity of those sequences. Performance-wise, Price totally steals the show as Nicholas. He becomes the role so effortlessly, playing both a sweet yet tormented soul in the opening and doing a terrifying job of playing Nicholas's father Sebastian later in the movie. It's a total dual-role performance, and I think he absolutely nails both aspects. He's amazing. Unfortunately, anything I say about the performances of the rest of the cast may give away some critical spoilers about how the film pans out, but I will say that Barbara Steele, John Kerr, Anthony Carbone and Luana Anders are equally brilliant. Particularly Barbara Steele, who's just breathtaking as Elizabeth. She's not on screen a lot, but whoo boy, when she is, she steals it from Price, and that's an achievement worth shouting about. Finally, the soundtrack. It's gorgeous. That's all I can really say about it. Corman's films are usually notoriously great on the OST front, and here it really doesn't disappoint, with a rich and delightful string orchestral arrangement that really plays to this film's already lush set design and production. It's a pounding and powerful range of classical compositions that only further punctuates the tense moments and amplifies the already fantastic performances and cine on screen. It's gorgeous, and I'd probably listen to it isolated, let alone as part of this feature. It's brilliant. Overall, The Pit and the Pendulum is a masterful work, showcasing both Corman and Price arguably at the peak of their creative powers. With a fantastic script, good solid direction and cine, next level performances and a soundtrack to die for, it's quite possibly my favourite of the Poe film adaptations, and a damn fine movie experience. Highly recommended, this really is one not to miss.